Perfect. So hi, greetings everyone. Once again, it's our pleasure to welcome all of you to Knowledge Management for Biodiversity webinar series. My name is Abhinav, and I'm joined here by my colleagues, Frederick Vogel, Jesse Monnier, and the head of the Capacity Building and Knowledge Management Unit at the Secretariat, Mr. Eddie Tamale, in welcoming you all. The theme of today's webinar is Knowledge Management for Conservation and Restoration Success. And to present on this topic, we have with us today Ms. Deshni Pillay, Chief Director of Biodiversity Information and Policy Advice of South African National Biodiversity Institute. She is accompanied by her colleague, Ms. Tammy Smith. As usual, the presentation will be followed by a very short question and answer round. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window to post your questions and remarks. Before we start, I'll also just like to mention that this entire webinar is being recorded through Zoom, and this recording will be made available on our web page. The link of the web page will be shared in the chat window. Also, please note that due to the bandwidth issues, our presenter may turn off their videos to ensure a smooth flow of presentation. So with this, now I request Ms. Deshni Pillay to take the floor.
Sure. Thank you very much, Abhinav, and thank you to the Secretariat for giving me a chance to share with you South Africa's experience in knowledge management. Tammy, will you put the slide show up, please? Thank you. Slideshow. And then I'm just going to put my video off so that you can hear me properly. Thank you. So today, I'm going to go through quite a few case studies. So how I've designed the presentation is just to provide you with a few case studies on how South Africa has implemented knowledge management. Tammy, you can go to the next slide, please. This is just the outline of the presentation. So really looking at SANBI's role, the South African National Biodiversity Institute, the role we play in the biodiversity sector, and then our mandate with regards to mobilizing data for policy advice and decision-making. Then I'm going to speak about how we've actually practically made this work, and I'm going to be illustrating that through our four-way action plan. And then I'm going to touch a bit on the mainstreaming history. We've got about 20 years of mainstreaming history in South Africa. I'll touch on a few experiences using the four-way action plan. So those are the different actions within the four-way action plan. And then I'm going to just reflect on some of our experiences from the region. So projects that we've been involved in within the region. And then lastly, we will reflect on some lessons. So the presentation is available for distribution. And for you just to note that there's quite a few links to videos and to other websites and URLs so that I'll make reference to it as we go through the presentation. Okay, next slide, please. So this really is a slide just talks about SANBI's role in the sector. So for many of you to note that SANBI is a knowledge-based state-owned institution. So we mainly get our grant from the fiscus. We're an entity of the National Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. And then also to note that besides being a knowledge-based institution, we also bring in our own income through our network of national botanical gardens. And recently, as in the last 5 years, we also host the National Zoological Gardens, which has a very big component on research, especially around genomics. So SANBI really operates at the interface between research, policy, and implementation. And we really look at ensuring that we have the best available science and evidence to inform policy and decision-making. And the infographic on the slide just shows the different spheres that we really work in. And you'll see that it encapsulates sustainable development quite well, because we really link with taking the biodiversity science into policy and then really looking at society's challenges. Next slide. So this, if anything, I'd really like you to think and take this slide as a take-home message. So really, none of this work can happen without the three areas of work, and that's really looking at people, products, and process. And all of this, these lessons have come from a publication that we have put together, looking at the challenges and lessons from biodiversity mainstreaming in South Africa. It's quite an in-depth review of our experiences and insights for mainstreaming biodiversity and development in South Africa. And you'll note as I go through the presentations and the various case studies that all of this work happens with through a social process involving people, involving collaboration, really within a community of practice. And then the various knowledge products that are developed are really co-developed with our stakeholders and our partners. And all of that is taken through a process of mainstreaming. Next slide. So this slide just looks at our knowledge managed continuum, really looking at how data moves into evidence and then really finds its place into policy. And if you look at the green blocks in the middle section of the slide, I'm going to be focusing on each of these examples in the presentation. So really looking at how we collect and collate our biodiversity data and take it into, make some meaning of it into assessment, prioritization, and planning, and then looking at how we mainstream biodiversity into land use planning and environmental assessment. Of course, all of this, if you think about that first, the slide before this, it all can't happen if you don't collaborate with your partners and have the various communities of practice. So really just encapsulating the lessons that we've learned so far. Thank you. Next slide, please. So SANBI has the mandate to serve biodiversity data. And we do this through our Biodiversity Advisor. It's a centralized platform that serves biodiversity data with our partners and stakeholders. So we work with our data partners through data sharing agreements where our information is easily accessible and easy to use, and the various information and knowledge products as well. So that's the URL to the Biodiversity Advisor. It's on the slide and also in the notes. For you just to note that SANBI's Biodiversity Advisor is also being updated, and that's why we don't have any ecosystem records uploaded, because it's an area of work that we're still working on. SANBI also is the national GBIF node, and really we strive to drive a stronger biodiversity agenda for South Africa, and we include strengthening biodiversity data mobilization, capacity building to enable the management of biodiversity data. SANBI also supports the sharing and publishing of biodiversity data for several countries in Africa. And we do this through the partnership that we have being the GBIF node. Next slide. So another flagship project that I'd like to focus on, which also illustrates quite nicely how we collate all of this biodiversity information, the data that we collect, is our National Biodiversity Assessment. So we've got almost 20 years of biodiversity assessment experience in South Africa, having published our first National Spatial Biodiversity Assessment in 2004. So we're currently busy developing our fourth iteration of the National Biodiversity Assessment, and that should be available next year. And I'm going to take you through this, today in my presentation, I'm going to take you through the process that we went through when we developed our National Biodiversity Assessment. Okay, next slide. Okay, so our National Biodiversity Assessment, the last iteration was completed in 2018. Just for colleagues to note that this is a 5-year process. And in the last iteration, we had 478 contributors, most of which were outside of SANBI. And the top block, you could see those are the governance structures that we've put in place, really looking at the ecosystem classification. We've set up some committees, and similarly for the species, we've set up species specialist groups. At the bottom, you'll be able to see the disaggregation of the various stakeholders involved in contributing to the National Biodiversity Assessment. And you'll see quite a skewed percentage towards the state. So lots of government departments, universities, and public entities that contribute to data for our National Biodiversity Assessment. In total, we had about 93 institutions that worked collectively to produce this publication. And then just to note that the documents are available as a synthesis report, and then we also have technical realm reports for each of the realms, as well as a popular version of the key facts, findings, and messages. Next slide, please. So this is just a representation of some of the information that's contained in the National Biodiversity Assessment. You can see that you would get a map product, and then you would also get the bar graphs. And really this slide is to highlight the headline indicators in the National Biodiversity Assessment. So we have 4 headline indicators: ecosystem threat status and ecosystem protection level, as well as species threat status and species protection level. So in this case, you can see that if we look at freshwater fish in the species bar graph, you'll see freshwater fish are the most threatened taxonomic group in the species bar graphs. And then if you look at ecosystem protection level, you can see that that we have wetlands that are least protected in the ecosystem protection level within that realm. So yeah, you could get the information represented in bar graphs or in a map. It's the same information. Okay, next slide. So here I'm just showing that all of this biodiversity data that's collected on ecosystems and species really interfaces with a national biodiversity monitoring framework. And it's looking at the National Biodiversity Assessment and the headline indicators can serve various other functions. They really, the data that's the foundational data that's used can also be used to do the ecosystem accounts, and SANBI has been piloting ecosystem accounts. We've just recently published the strategic water source areas accounts. And all of this information that we're collecting for the national biodiversity assessments can have various other uses. So they're also being used for the sustainable development goal reporting, and then other sector-specific planning. And I'm going to go more into detail when I provide some examples. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So this slide really is to, I've mentioned already that the suite of publications that we have for the National Biodiversity Assessment, besides the synthesis reports and the technical realm reports, we also have a summary document on the key facts, findings, and messages. And this was the last NBA. We really had 3 sets of messages, key messages, and in the new NBA, we're going to be refining them to have few messages, but really targeting them to various sectors and for decision makers. So this was an opportunity for us to really take our messages to inform policies and strategies and really inform national reporting. So a lot of this information fed into our State of Environment report. It also fed into our international reporting to the CBD and for the SDG reports. Thanks. Next slide. So now I'm going to chat about how South Africa actually went about doing this. And because we're a developing country, we're also a mega diverse country, we have to balance our developmental needs with our conservation requirements. So we need to prioritize. Of course, we can't act everywhere, so we needed to identify priority areas. And I'm going to look at the 4-way action plan and explain how we managed to do this and use it to explain with some case studies and examples. So the 4-way action plan is really looking at avoiding and reducing loss, looking at protection, restoration, and then to reduce pressures. So there will be some examples, but a lot of this information, for example, looked at identifying areas to expand protected areas, and then to avoid and reduce loss. Information on our EIA screening tool looked at where you could develop. So I will go through some of these examples. Thank you. You can move to the next slide. So in terms of the spatial biodiversity planning, South Africa has quite a lot of experience in terms of spatial planning. Really looking at providing various products to you that will be used to inform planning and decision making. And we really targeted a range of sectors, including protected areas expansion, land use planning, environmental impact assessment, classification of water resources, mining authorization, and really looking at how these tools can be used to ensure efficient decision making. Okay, next slide. So there's quite a few slides, and before I move on to mainstreaming, Abhinav, we can take a short pause in case there's any questions of clarity on what I've presented so far.
Sure, definitely, Deshni. And thanks a lot for the presentation so far. So far, I don't see any question posted in the question and answer section. And also there is nothing in the chat window. So maybe, our participants, they are still waiting for more slides to be shown before they have their questions. But then I'd also want to I would like to invite our participants that if they have any questions so far on the slides that have been shown and the presentation that has been given by Deshni, please go ahead and ask your question. And I can see that the question has already been posted by Mr. Numan Kadir. The question is, what are the main pressures in minimizing biodiversity loss?
Okay, so I'm going to ask Tammy to put the answers on in the chat if that's fine. I'd like to move on with the presentation. There's about 40 slides and we're just not even halfway. So I just wanted to have a small pause. Tammy is going to be answering some questions, and then when we have time at the end, I'll also come in with some of the answers, if that's okay.
Perfect, perfect.
Sure. Thank you, okay, great. So now I'm going to be changing so initially my first part of the presentation was really looking at how South Africa has pulled together the various data sources for the different uses. I want to focus now on how we've taken that and mainstream that data, that information into the other sectors. And then after this, I may just pause and take some questions. So SANBI and South Africa has a long history of mainstreaming. And we've started this through mainly our GEF-funded projects. So the first project was the Cape Action Plan for People and the Environment, almost 20 years ago, in 2004. And it really aimed to ensure that the biodiversity of the Cape Floristic region is conserved, restored, and effectively managed and sustainably used, and really focused on delivering significant benefits to people of that region, because the Cape Floristic region is also an area that is severely threatened, but also utilized by the people, local communities. And it was during this Cape program that the concept arose of taking science into action, and this was through a coordinated involvement of multiple stakeholders. So the Cape Action for People and Environment involved quite a few different stakeholders, including government, NGOs, community research organizations. And I've mentioned it was funded by the Global Environment Facility and the Critical Ecosystem Partnership. You can move into the next slide, Tammy. So then we, through the Cape project, we really looked at how we're going to be taking this fine-scale work and mainstreaming it into the municipal sector. So putting biodiversity plans to work really was the first project with municipalities, and aimed at getting our biodiversity planning products into their plans and their processes. And there were many lessons that were learned in those early days about how products were developed and presented. And you will see in the next slide that the amount of and the effort that goes into hand-holding and really working with the municipality to use the product was really first understood in this project. And if you recollect that first slide, I said it is the take-home message from this presentation. It's really about process. So process is as much to do with the whole, it has a lot to do with the mainstreaming process than just the product. It's also about finding a champion within the municipality that you're working in, or any sector that you're working in, really finding that champion to work with that you can embed this process. Okay, move to the next slide. And I think this slide really captures the effort that goes into mainstreaming. So what our research and what our experience and practice has found is that the actual product, the plan, the assessment, the tool is just about 10 to 20% of the whole process. And the rest of the 80 to 90% is really about how you actually work with it, developing guidelines, doing the training, making people aware of how to use your plan, your knowledge product. So a lot of that work, the hard work, is really embedded in the 80 to 90%, where once something is finished and really looking at how we work with that to make connections to it, especially if we're working with another sector, making that connection to the work is important. And I also wanted to illustrate in the slide is that the visible process is the biodiversity assessment or the plan or the knowledge product. But a lot of the invisible process is that 90% are really working with it within your sector, with your champions, and really making the meaning and creating the connection to this knowledge product. And I really wanted to highlight that. Okay, next slide. So our second GEF-funded project was, of course, the National Grassland Project. And the National Grassland Project came up with 6 main factors for effectively mainstreaming biodiversity. And really, through the Grasslands Project, we did a dedicated piece of research to support making the case for biodiversity. So what we found is through the CAPE project that there was quite a lot of money and many partners involved in that project, and yet we were still missing, not getting our message across. And through the Grasslands Project, we were really looking at how do we provide some evidence to support making the case for biodiversity. And through this making the case, we also concluded that competent leadership must help to identify and develop high quality tools in partnership with sector stakeholders. And then further, a good biodiversity business case must be made for the conservation of biodiversity. We also found that sector-based discussion groups and training, capacity building, workshops were needed to help increase the capacity within both the regulatory organizations and then also the industry. And then the pilot projects tested concepts and provided sound policy advice. And I'm going to reflect on a few of those concepts as we move further down the presentation. Next slide. So some of the findings was that when we undertook this research, we found that we often fail in our messaging because the term biodiversity is not well understood. And then also the communication from the biodiversity sector, sometimes contradictory, often confusing. And then there's also messages of gloom and doom and about biodiversity loss. And really, a lot of the research showed that there was messaging of fear of loss and not hope of gain. And we really looked at how do we, through this making the case work, change the narrative. And then another key issue was the disconnect between economic development and biodiversity. And this is especially for developing countries that have high levels of poverty, unemployment, inequality. And then at the bottom, there's the biodiversity sector trying to compete with these high levels of developmental challenges. And then we are, so we just missing each other. We're not able to connect with the national priorities of the country. Next slide. So through this research, SANBI started repositioning its communication messages to show how biodiversity is essential for job creation and service delivery and addressing poverty and inequality. So this process introduced a new communications language for the biodiversity sector and really focus on delivering a value proposition for biodiversity. And a key turning point occurred when SANBI, of course, published a toolkit for the making the case for biodiversity. And this change in approach showed how SANBI packaged its scientific information so that it was more effective, because it did not seek to prohibit development completely, but rather looked at where are the opportunities for development. And then just to note that the key messaging found that there were 3 aspects that we needed to connect with. The head, looking at an economic value, looking at rational arguments to conserve biodiversity and how it contributes to national development. And then looking at the heart, emotional value, emotional messages, passing on biodiversity to the next generation. So looking at intergenerational equity. And then lastly, looking at the practical value, the hands. What were the messages and what was the call to action? What could we do as the biodiversity sector? So the making the case research really came up with these 3 big things that we needed to implement. Next slide. And this is when we coined the term, through the making the case work, we introduced the idea of ecological infrastructure. So we found that the term infrastructure resonated with the country's current focus on encouraging development through the built infrastructure. We also had several strategic infrastructure projects on trying to stimulate the economy and being used as a growth strategy. And we found that the term ecological infrastructure gained traction with engineers, development planners, government officials, mainly from the water and agricultural sector. We found that ecological infrastructure gained particular attention in the water sector, where the links between healthy natural ecosystems in the catchments and the provision of water as a direct benefit to people was where it was really well aligned. And especially in a country like South Africa that is water scarce, the issue of poor catchment management upstream, overgrazing, illegal plowing, or draining wetlands, how all of those pressures contributed to erosion that washed downstream and it deposited into dams, thereby reducing the capacity over time. So really making the case for investing in ecological infrastructure to lengthen the lifespan of existing built infrastructure. And then sometimes even reducing the need to build additional infrastructure. So really, we managed to see a different way of bringing built and ecological infrastructure to provide benefits for nature and for people. Okay, you can move to the next slide. And then just to note how the ecological infrastructure actually was illustrated by another GEF-funded project called the Ecological Infrastructure for Water Security Project. Now I'm going to be really, I've thrown in quite a few concepts as we came to this to this part of the presentation. And here I just wanted to clarify the terms that I have been using. So really looking at the relationship between mainstreaming, making the case, and policy advice. So mainstreaming, we're looking at really is the integration of biodiversity considerations into the policies, the plans, and then the decisions of other sectors. And policy advice, of course, is the provision of strategic and technical input on biodiversity-related aspects of policy and legislation. And you'll note in this infographic that not all policy advice is mainstreaming. So there will be some areas of policy advice that are outside of the mainstreaming realm. And then making the case for biodiversity, really bringing all of this together, is conveying the importance of managing and conserving biodiversity to a broad audience to elicit support and action. And it's really the main framing of pulling all of these messages together. And then making the case is really, it would require different framing in different contexts. And in the South African context, our work has shown that it really, really requires communicating the benefits of biodiversity for people and nature, but really looking at it from a rational and an emotional perspective, as well as ensuring the availability of practical tools for action. So that call to action, the hands, really all of us saying, coming together to make a difference. So this is in strong contrast to the messages of crisis, threat, loss that are frequently used by some proponents of the biodiversity sector. So I just wanted to bring all of that together, looking at the relationship between mainstreaming, making the case, and policy advice. So Abhinav, we can pause now if we're wanting to do the survey that Frederick has, and also maybe I can look at the questions and answers in the meantime and provide some input. And then, because the next set of slides is really going to be looking at some case studies and some examples. So I can pause here.
Sure, thank you, Deshni. So as you know, today we are conducting an audience poll during this presentation to know a little more about our participants and their possible interests in the area of knowledge management and GBF. And my colleague Fred will be sharing this survey very soon in this presentation, and he has already shared it. So I'll encourage all the participants to please take the survey. It should not take you more than a couple of minutes to complete it. I think it has 4 questions, if I'm right, correct, Fred?
Two questions.
2 questions, okay. So it has just 2 questions, and your answers would help us to know more about you, and it may also help us to structure the Q&A session in a more meaningful way. So Fred, I think you are able to see the responses which are coming in, and you can take the call when you would want to stop sharing the poll.
Yeah, a few more minutes here.
Sure.
Only 22 data. Yeah. Please, please just respond if you see the poll on your screen. You can respond. So far, 23 people have answered. What we see that we have quite a lot of government colleagues joining this call, and then some people from universities, IPLCs as well. That's for the first question.
Perfect. I'd also want to, just inform all the participants that the survey is completely anonymous. So while you are submitting your answers, your details and your names are not being captured.
Yes, and from the second questions, where we ask maybe about your level of knowledge management in your organizations, we see 50% have started the discussion around KM, and some don't know. And yes, good to see that at least 10-12% have already deployed KM solutions in their governments or organization, which is very good.
Fred, so is there a way to graphically represent the results in some way and then share it maybe at the end of this presentation with the audience?
Okay, I thought this was viewable, but I'm ending the poll in a few seconds more, and maybe then you will see it, is it? I'm sending it now. And I'm sharing the results. It's the first time we do this on Zoom, so yeah, here are the results.
Okay, so I'll quickly read out the results for everybody. Our first question was, who do you work or represent? And 29% participants responded government, 25% NGOs, 14% indigenous people and local communities, 14% academia, UN and intergovernmental organizations 14%, industry and private sector 7%, and others 11%. So we have quite a full spectrum of participants. And then to the second question, which is what level of knowledge management have you reached in your organization? 50%, they said that they have started discussion on KM. 11%, they have developed a KM strategy. For 7%, a KM pilot project is underway. 11% have said that they have deployed KM solutions, and 21% they are still in the don't know zone. So I think the results are very instructive and very insightful. So Deshni, with this, I think we can close the survey and you can start on the third part of your presentation.
Sure, thank you. So Tammy, if you're ready, we can move to the next slide. I'm going to be focusing on a few case studies, and I'd like to draw the audience attention to the earlier slide where I spoke about the 4-way action plan. So this is the 4-way action plan, and I'm going to be providing some examples of how we've implemented the 4-way action plan. And I will use some of the knowledge products that we have developed for mainstreaming purposes, for decision support purposes, but I will focus on the 4 areas. So avoid and reduce loss, protect, restore, and then reduce pressures. Okay, you can move to the next slide. So in about 2013, together with our then Department of Environmental Affairs and then our Department of Mineral Resources, SANBI and the South African Chamber of Mines developed a knowledge product called Mining and Biodiversity Guideline. And really this guideline provided a tool to facilitate the sustainable development of South Africa's mineral resources that in a way that enables regulators, the industry and practitioners to minimize the impact of mining on the country's biodiversity and ecosystem services. It really provided the mining sector with a very practical, user-friendly manual for integrating our biodiversity considerations into the planning processes and looking at how do we manage biodiversity during the operational phases of a mine, right through from exploration down to closure. So this guideline was really welcomed by the sector and certainly by the Chamber of Mines, because it provided the guideline provided explicit direction in terms of where mining-related impacts were legally prohibited, where biodiversity priority areas may be present for high risks of mining projects. So they were able, before they even looked at getting into the mining industry, really looking at how risky this project would be. And really, this guideline distinguished between 4 categories of biodiversity priority areas in relation to the importance from biodiversity and ecosystem service point of view. So really looked at 4 categories of biodiversity sensitivities. Okay, next slide. Then another example is really looking at how we managed to get the biodiversity framing into integrated into our national spatial development framework. And we managed to even get ecological infrastructure and strategic water source areas as sub-frames within the National Spatial Development Framework. And this work was done, it was an opportune moment because the National Planning Commission, together with our Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and our Department of Agriculture, Rural Development and Land Reform, that were really mandated to come up with the National Spatial Development Framework. And this was as a result of a piece of legislation that was published. The Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act had regulated that we, legislated that we needed as a country to develop a national spatial development framework. And what we managed to do is really work with the key departments in developing the National Spatial Development Framework, but also looked at how we, by holding their hands and then attending all of their meetings, even doing some of the presentations, we were able to mainstream the integration of biodiversity priorities and strategic water source areas into this National Spatial Development Framework. And now we are assisting the relevant departments in implementing the National Spatial Development Framework by supporting the development of the National Spatial Development Framework Implementation Plan. So our work, when I spoke about the 90% of the work, it doesn't just end when you have a product. It really, that's the start of the hard work. It really takes quite a lot of effort to mainstream that information into the sector. And so we're also participating in the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Forum, where various national tools related to spatial planning and land use management are discussed. So really involving ourselves in the communities of practice and bringing the experience and expertise and our practice into that space. Okay, moving to the next slide. So this is a really interesting tool, and SANBI has really supported the development of the environmental screening tool. It's really an online screening tool, and it's been gazetted. So all development applications in South Africa would need to screen, get into the screening tool, and then look at the biodiversity sensitivities for the particular site. So within the environmental management program of work, so we've managed to integrate biodiversity into the environmental impact assessment, EIA regulations, as well as in the screening tool, which screens all EIA applications. And it also produces a report before those applications are even submitted to the decision makers. And this is a national web-based environmental screening tool. It's geographically based web-enabled application, and it allows a proponent intending to submit an application to really look at what are the biodiversity and environmental sensitivities on the particular site. The screening tool also provides EIA processes, and then also looks at if there's any specialist studies that need to be done. We also have the plant and animal species protocols that aim to standardize species level aspects of EIAs, and then also to provide a report of the potential impacts from these proposed developments on species of conservation concern. So all threatened species and other species are really, we have these protocols on, and it advises you on how you can proceed with your application. Okay, you can move on to the next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to be talking about strategic water source areas, and this is another important ecological infrastructure for South Africa. So we have 22 surface strategic water source areas, and these are really, they cover about 8% of the land, but they deliver 50% of South Africa's water. So really important mountain catchment areas mainly, and support quite a lot of the urban population, certainly in 2/3 of the economy and half the population. So it also provides 70% of the water for irrigation. So it's a vital ecological infrastructure asset for water security and for food security. And the map that's shown on the slide just is a representation of the fine-scale surface strategic water source areas. Those are the 22, and we've managed to do fine-scale delineation of these 22. We also have 34 groundwater strategic water source areas, and we are starting to do some work on the groundwater work, and we've got a 2 Green Climate Fund project that should come on board in the next year, where we'll be really looking strategically at how we secure our ground strategic water source areas. Okay, next slide. So important for you to note that our strategic water source areas are also reflected in our medium-term strategic framework, which is really our 5-year program of work of government. And we have a target there of securing 50% of our strategic water source areas, which is 11 strategic water source areas to be secured by 2024. And SANBI is doing a lot of the research to support our national department on securing the strategic water source area. We also have this as one of our APP targets, our annual performance plan targets, where we're really working with municipalities that house all of the strategic water source areas. We have about 34 of them, and we've managed to prioritize over the next 2 years to really work with mainstreaming the strategic water source areas into their municipal planning and decision making. Next slide. So I just wanted to, as we focus on strategic water source areas, also important to note that restoring, if you're looking at the 4-way action plan, restoring ecological infrastructure is also a big component of work. And we have quite a big program of work on looking at alien clearing, especially developed through partnerships in critical catchments, really looking at the nexus of land, water, and people, and looking at how we create job opportunities from trying to secure and maintain ecological infrastructure for water security. We've implemented this work by targeting unemployed youth, especially in our rural areas, and many of them have enjoyed some short-term employment as eco-champs. And because they've received training in many of our citizen science tools and our monitoring protocols, they've now been employed by several NGOs in the critical catchments to take up that work. So it's feeding into a broader monitoring framework. We've managed to really build capacity and transfer skills. But I'm going to focus on one case study. You can move to the next slide. So as part of our COVID Green Economic Recovery program, SANBI participated in the Presidential Economic Stimulus Project over 2 years. And we really wanted to look at the biodiversity sector to really start stimulating the economy and looking at creating jobs that can benefit people and nature. And so we had a big injection of funding through these 2 projects that we implemented for 6 months. And you can see it was distributed all over the country. And we had various interventions. So we looked at restoring ecological infrastructure. And with that, we looked at removing alien invasive plants. And then we looked at the eco-champs I've already reflected on, where we use citizen science tools to really monitor some of the ecological infrastructure in critical catchments. And then with an NGO, we actually looked at implementing about 758 jobs we created in one ward, a wattle-infested ward, where in 10 villages, mainly looking at youth and women being employed. For many of the women had never been employed before. And for the first time, they had received employment through a public-funded employment opportunity. And we managed to, in total, in all of these interventions, we managed to clear just under 7,000 hectares of alien plants. And then we created just over 4,000 job opportunities. And you can see it was distributed throughout the country in the various provinces, really looking at critical catchments that needed this investment. Okay, next slide. So during that project, we also managed to capture quite a lot of material. We did videos, we did surveys. We also have a popular publication where we documented the benefits that this project provided. So there are some YouTube videos. I'm not going to be presenting them today, but at your leisure, you can have a look at them. But these are just 2 youth ambassadors that we employed through this presidential economic stimulus, really looking at investing in ecological infrastructure and collecting data. We were able to employ the youth in these critical catchments. Okay, so now I am moving on to the last part of this presentation. I divided it into 3 parts. So now I'm going to be really looking at some regional projects that SANBI has been supporting. And these are the ones that I will be talking about. So there's about 4 projects that SANBI that I've highlighted to share with the audience this afternoon. So we're really looking at, I'm going to be, thank you, move to the next slide. That's it, you can move, yes. So the first project is, I'd like to reflect on, is the African Biodiversity Challenge. It was a project that was run in 2 phases and funded by the JRS Foundation, Biodiversity Foundation, really aimed at building capacity and providing incentives for countries to mobilize their biodiversity data, and really looked at establishing biodiversity informatic networks. And that's what we managed to do in Rwanda, Ghana, Malawi, and Namibia. And those were the countries that were involved in phase 1. In phase 2 was another funding opportunity, and we aim to really unlock decision data pathways for sustainable development, and really looking at how we took this data that was collected into decision making. And there we focused on Rwanda, Ghana, and Malawi. You can move on to the next slide. Okay, the next project that I wanted to focus on is the Connect project. So the Connect project really aimed at mainstreaming biodiversity information into the heart of government decision-making. And this project focused on 3 countries, Mozambique, Ghana, and Uganda. And SANBI provided a lot of the capacity building, where we focused on developing the biodiversity information products, looked at the biodiversity data needed to be collated, and looking at and bringing everything together so that it can be collated into a meaningful a tool, and then for it to be used for decision making. And then I just wanted to highlight that in Uganda, this project received a presidential award because of the outstanding input that it made in advancing biodiversity as a cause. And really important to see how we've managed to take that the biodiversity information into decision making so that it could have a meaningful impact. Okay, next slide. Okay, now I'm going to be reflecting on another project that we implemented in collaboration with UNEP WCMC. This is mainstream mapping biodiversity priorities, implemented in 3 countries, Malawi, Botswana, and Ethiopia, and really looked at developing a practical science-based approach to national biodiversity assessment and prioritization. And this was really to inform strategy and action planning. So this document that we developed, it's also available. There is a link in the notes of this presentation, so you can access it. It sets out a practical science-based approach, really looking to enable spatial biodiversity assessment and prioritization, and really looking at how we can apply this at a national level in any country. And the key aspect was looking at the various realms, so looking at the terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine realms. It really looked at taking a few basic data sets that can be combined to produce useful headline indicators, so that we can report on the state of biodiversity, and then also look at mapping map products that can help to focus and prioritize conservation action across the landscape and the seascape. So both these documents are available on the link, and if you access the presentation, you'll be able to access the documents. Yeah, so thanks, Tammy. You can move to the next slide. Then a second part of this project was taking, so first we did mapping biodiversity priorities. And then we had an opportunity to take it into mainstreaming biodiversity priorities. Also, a project developed with UNEP WCMC, implemented in Malawi, Ghana, and Ethiopia, the same countries. And this was the publication that was developed, also can be accessed from the SANBI repository, really explains how to mainstream spatial biodiversity products, and looking at how we need to work with a range of sectors to incorporate that biodiversity considerations into decision making. And then key to note that really looking at improvements in biodiversity, ecosystems, and human well-being. So that was really a big focus of this project. Okay, thank you. You can move to the next slide. Okay, so the last project is a project we're currently busy with, being funded by the French Development Agency. And we are currently the lead implementing agency of the SBAP project, looking at building biodiversity knowledge for action in Southern Africa, and with a real focus on spatial biodiversity assessment, prioritization, and planning. And it's being implemented in South Africa, Mozambique, Namibia, and Malawi. So these are the 4 SADC countries that we're busy working with. This is a 5-year project. It runs from last year, July, to June 2027, and really aims to develop and enhance national spatial biodiversity assessments, prioritization, and planning. And so really looking at developing the processes to support those functions, and then also looking at developing products in these 4 Southern African countries. And a focus on strengthening the national knowledge base on biodiversity to ensure that the knowledge informs land use planning and decision making, and really also influences development of environmental policies and strategies, and provides a basis for future biodiversity monitoring. The project involves technical and scientific cooperation from all 4 countries, and really that is to undertake the mapping of ecosystem types with a special focus on cross-border ecosystems, then to compile and develop spatial data on terrestrial ecological condition at both national and regional levels, enhance species and ecosystem red list assessments. And this, just to connect with a question that's come up on the chat. So the red list system that we use is the IUCN red list assessment system, and we've been implementing it in South Africa. We've been implementing the red list of species, and we've tested and implemented the red list of ecosystems that the IUCN has published. And in this project, we're looking at identifying priority areas through integrated spatial planning, and then looking at how we mainstream these priorities into key decision-making processes. Okay, so those are all the projects that we're done with. You can move to the next slide. The last slide, or last meaningful slide, is really looking at some of the lessons learned for mobilizing biodiversity data. And here, these are just picked from a few presentations that we shared at various global engagements. And many global data sets are useful, but they are available, but really they're not useful for national level decision-making and policy processes. And that's the key lesson for mobilizing biodiversity data at national level, is really to invest in national data sets and applications to build the capacity at national level so that we can assist with national level reporting. And what we found in South Africa, because we're doing quite a lot of this national level reporting and we mainstream it into decision making, it's easier for us to feed into global data sets and then also feed into global reporting. Another key learning from all of this work that we've been doing over the years, the last 2 decades, that really what we need is hands-on peer-to-peer learning exchanges. And we saw that with Connect, and we saw that with other projects that we've implemented, is that really going in and having the different technical groups, technical experts talk to each other, sharing experiences, and using relevant data in the country to make decisions, and then also to design applications that are applicable for that country's needs. And what we've also found, lastly, is that there's quite a lot of national level expertise that exists. And we can bring in these national level experts, and they may not all be, they could be citizen science or amateur botanists, and they could be experts in their country. But there's quite a lot of information, data, knowledge, and expertise that exists at that level, and we really need to be making use of that level of information, bring that into curating the global data sets. So those are just some of the lessons that I wanted to reflect on all of the projects and some of the case studies that I've shared today. You can move on to the next slide. These are some of the references and useful documents that we've used. You can also access a lot of the links when you access the presentation. There's URLs, there's, like I've shared before, there's videos. So there's lots of resources. You can also access our Biodiversity Advisor. And it's a repository of all our knowledge products. So you can access SANBI's information through that. And then lastly, there's the contact details of the team that's working on our knowledge management program. So I did the presentation, but I'm supported by Mukhadi and Dr. Tammy Smith. That's really the brain behind the knowledge management and coordination unit in SANBI. So I think that's it, Abhinav. I can pause here. And
thank you, Deshni, and your entire team for this very excellent presentation. And usually we have 2 separate presenters from different organizations or parties in each webinar. But today you were alone able to cover most comprehensive range and depth of information, which I'm sure our participants would have found very useful. I think it was quite instructive to see the systematic and scientific approach that SANBI has taken for capturing biodiversity information and data and mainstreaming biodiversity, and also the way you have been able to leverage the model of people, product, and processes in your approach. It's clear that a lot of thinking and planning has been invested over years in this approach, and definitely the results are very impressive. So I think we are ready to now move to the dedicated Q&A round of the session. Just before we start on that, I would like to remind our participants that we do not have any webinar session next week, which is 17th of October, due to the Substat 25 sessions in Nairobi. So the floor is open for all the participants to questions. This is also your opportunity, Deshni, to answer some of the questions you feel that you need to answer in voice. You can take a look at the question and answers in the Q&A tab. I can see that almost 5 questions have been answered already, and there are 3 open. So I'll let you take the call on this.
Sure. Okay, thank you. So I'm trying to read the questions, and thank you to my colleagues that have answered some of the questions. So is it Noman? What were the main take-home messages on how to minimize biodiversity loss observed globally? So I have to say that from our national biodiversity assessment, we didn't focus on the global how to deal with global biodiversity loss. We really looked at so if you look at the presentation, maybe Tammy, you can move to the slide on the headline indicators. And what we really presented in our national biodiversity assessment was to look at how we collated the information into 4 headline indicators. So we really focused on ecosystems and species. And we looked here, if you can see this slide, we really, this was the core of the headline indicators in our national biodiversity assessment. And based on all of the data sets that we had collected for the national biodiversity assessments, land cover, all the ecosystem assessments that we did using the IUCN global guideline, and then the species guideline. These were the high-level headline indicators that we reported on our national biodiversity assessment. And you could see that I think the key driver for biodiversity loss is agriculture in our national biodiversity assessment, and of course it's land use change. So those are the 2 big contributors to biodiversity loss in South Africa. And of course, I mean, being a developing country, being a country that is also has high levels of food insecurity, we have to balance our developmental needs with our agricultural, with our conservation needs. So really looking at how we balance our development to reduce our developmental challenges, and then looking at our food security. But these were the high-level indicators, and you can see if you even look at the synthesis report, you can look at for example, I did highlight that freshwater fish are the most threatened taxonomic group, and we should focus our policies and interventions on that area. And then another area, ecosystem that we should be looking at, ecosystem type, is the wetlands. They're not well protected, and really look at putting government funding, looking at interventions around conserving wetlands. And as a result of that, we have quite a big program working for wetlands that invests in securing wetlands. And then also looking at the work that I shared around our strategic water source areas, really looking at how we, because we're a water scarce country, how we looking at addressing water security. So I think that's, I hope I've covered your question. Just looking at the others, how successful has the project among the Southern African countries been? So there's various, there's different levels of success. We've been involved in quite a few different African countries. And I mentioned in one of the slides that so for the Connect project, for example, we did quite a lot of in-country capacity building. So really working with the teams in setting up their biodiversity information management systems, looking at what biodiversity information products would be necessary. So in Ghana, for example, there was a big emphasis, and there was at the time a lot of emphasis on their National Planning Commission had a big project in the agricultural sector. And the agricultural sector had brought quite a lot of their data. So working with the data that was available and packaging it in a way that is useful for the conservation sector to make meaning out of it, and then also to provide that information to the agricultural sector to advise them on where to expand their agricultural production, for example. So there's in different countries, depending on the champions that we have, depending on the infrastructure that we have, the architecture that's available, we were designing different tools, different knowledge products, different information products. So each of the countries would have different interventions. But there's been quite a lot of success. And the last project that I reflected on, the spatial prioritization and assessment project that is currently being implemented, has been going quite well. And because we've got a lot of experience in implementing various guidelines like the red list system, the red list of species and ecosystems, as well as the national the spatial planning process, we're able to bring that expertise to the country and then train the experts in that country. So I hope that's okay, that I covered that question, Lauren. Okay, so many of the last question from Maureen, so many of the projects have been completed, like the mainstreaming, the mapping biodiversity priorities, the mainstreaming biodiversity priorities. The only project and Connect, they've all finished. Even the African Biodiversity Challenge. The only project that's still continuing is the last one that I presented on, the SBAP project, spatial prioritization. So most of them have been completed. We're just implementing the last one. I think those are all the questions. I hope that's it. Just looking at this chat group. Okay, so John's put a last question. Has the fine-scale biodiversity mapping at municipal scale started? And so yes, it's just started this financial year. So it will, we haven't seen any of the impacts yet. We've just done a whole lot of roadshows. I think we had 13 scheduled for this year, and we've managed to do 10 so far. Really looking at targeting the municipal structures where all the biodiversity, where the spatial planners come together. So we're not talking to the biodiversity, the conservation sector. We're really talking to the development planners. And I have a planner that goes to these presentations, and we take the biodiversity information into those planning sessions. We haven't, there is a methodology to measure. I had to remove the slide because there was just too much information. But there is a protocol on how to measure the impact, and we will be doing that in the next year. But for now, we haven't measured any of the impact because we're still busy with roadshows. So I think that's covering all the questions. Tammy and Fulu, I don't know if you want to bring in any, do you want to answer anything?
Yeah, thanks, Dash. I think I've already answered some of the questions. Yeah, they are on the answered tab there. So yeah, apart from that, you've already answered the remaining questions. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think, Abhinav, that's it from us. I think we covered all of the questions, and then, yeah, this presentation is there for any of the links and to even to contact us, the team. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Deshni, and thanks to your team. Eddie, would you like to step in and come in and say a few words here?
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, quite detailed and lots of lessons to learn from the South African experience. So we would like to thank you. You put in a lot in preparing this, and we thank you. I hope participants have benefited from this, and we look forward to more countries coming forward to share their experiences. I think if we get more of these type of experiences, I think knowledge management for biodiversity will move a notch higher, and we'll know at least what to do, and in terms of aiming to achieve the target 21 by 2030. So this is the beginning, and we would like to encourage more countries to come forth and share their experiences. So thank you very much. I particularly liked the project that you are working on, trying to bring biodiversity information directly into the hands of decision makers. I hope that project can be replicated in other countries, because that's what we are yearning for. Yes, there is limited data and information, but it's also there's also a lot that is not being utilized, and we need to see how do we bridge that gap and bring whatever we have available into the hands of the decision makers and the planners and the public, for that matter. So let's work towards achieving this in the coming few years, and we look forward to the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you for inviting me to share our experience. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks to the entire team, and thanks to all the participants. So with this, we are closing off the webinar. And as I mentioned to everybody, all the details, the videos, the presentations, they will be available on our website, which is https://km4b.cbd.int. Fred, can you share the link of the website in the chat, please, so that all the participants can visit it? And you will also find the links of all the previous presentations, the previous recordings of the previous webinars, and then the recording of the forthcoming webinars as well, once they are conducted. So have a good day and a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Sure, thank you. Bye.